Order, order. Good morning. Secretary of State, you are most welcome. Thank you for making yourself available today. We thought you might be stuck in a tunnel somewhere, so we're very glad to see you before us this morning. As usual, as you'll be very familiar, we have a lot of ground to cover, and as succinct answers as possible will be very helpful. Now, we know that the negotiations are continuing, and I suspect you'll probably say once or several times today that we'll have to wait and see what happens. Yeah. But can I ask you this question? Will the House still meet on Saturday if by then a revised legal text covering the Northern Ireland Protocol is not available for members of Parliament?
Well, you'll be aware of the comments that the Leader of the House made in the Chamber yesterday on that very issue, and I would refer you to that, Chair, and it will be for the Leader of the House tomorrow through the business in the normal way to set out what the House will be doing.
But if there isn't an agreement for the House to consider, what would we be discussing on Saturday?
Well, this is why we will see what the progress is today, and it will be for the Leader of the House, as is the norm, on Thursday to set out the order of business. And that's what he alluded to yesterday, and it will be for the Leader to set out.
But what would, just so I'm clear, what would be the point in the House meeting if there wasn't an agreement to discuss?
Well, you'll be familiar with your own legislation and the timescale that it sets. And that is why, as I say, it will be for the Leader of the House to set out whether we will be sitting or not, and it will obviously relate to the negotiations and the progress we're hoping to make today.
But the legislation, as you'll be well aware, is only relevant in those circumstances if there is an agreement which the government can put to the House to seek to get consent for it. If that consent is given, then the requirement to write a letter doesn't apply. So if there's no agreement, then I don't see how the Act is relevant as far as Saturday's business is concerned.
But the argument that was run yesterday by the member for Broxtowe was the opposite of that, which was that there's no requirement in the legislation for the House to sit in any event on Saturday. What I am saying is there are a number of issues that interplay with the legislation in your name. The normal course of business is not that ministers set out that during the week. It is set out by the Leader of the House. That is what the Leader of the House said to in the Chamber yesterday, and that is the position.
Right. Are you currently discussing a revised political declaration with the European Union?
Yes, we are.
And so you've submitted draft text?
We have submitted draft text as part of the negotiations on a number of aspects under discussion. As you will be aware, the position of the government was set out by the Prime Minister in his letter to President Juncker, on the 2nd of this month. And if there are changes to the backstop element of the Northern Ireland Protocol, then it stands to reason there would be consequential changes to the political declaration that flow from that as a consequence.
Okay, and would you expect the text of that revised political declaration to be available at the same time as a revised legal text on the withdrawal agreement whenever it becomes available? Would we see them both together?
Well, again, there's a number of areas of text that will be required, but we'd be seeking to put as much information before the House as possible in terms of the text that will be available.
But I'm just trying to establish whether they'd be available simultaneously, because presumably for there to be an agreement, it would have to be an agreement on both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Is that correct?
Well, it wasn't for the third meaningful vote, as you will recall, because the third meaningful vote was purely on the withdrawal agreement. It was not on the package. But you'll be also aware, Chair, that the first and second meaningful votes were very much on the package. In fact, you spoke very eloquently around your concerns in terms of the blind Brexit element of the political declaration. And yet, when we got to the third vote, it appeared that actually the political declaration wasn't the issue. In the way that it was referred to in the first and second votes, because when we had the third meaningful vote, which was a standalone vote on the withdrawal agreement in isolation, the three components being issues which many had previously said they agreed with, citizens' rights, Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the financial settlement, the House did not carry the withdrawal agreement in isolation. So again, part of this depends on the progress that we make in the talks, but also in terms of the interplay with your own legislation.
Okay. Can you confirm that if there is no agreement reached, which is approved by Parliament on Saturday, that by the end of the day the Prime Minister will write the letter that he is required to send by the European Union Withdrawal Number 2 Act?
Well, I can confirm, as the Prime Minister has repeatedly set out, that firstly the government will comply with the law, and secondly it will comply with undertakings given to the court in respect of the law.
Well, the undertaking given to the court was that, subject to section 1.5, in the event that neither of the conditions set out in sections 1.1 and 1.2 is satisfied, he will send a letter in the form set out in the schedule. Can you confirm for the committee, as the Secretary of State, that in those circumstances he will send the letter?
I confirm that the government will abide by what is set out in that letter.
Which will involve sending a letter, is that right?
You read it out, and I
helpful.
refer back to that text.
Well, that's hopeful that you have confirmed that he will send that letter. Do you know why the Prime Minister spent so long saying that he wouldn't?
Well, we're committed to leaving, as you know, Mr Benn, on the 31st of October. We think the best way of doing that is with a deal, to leave in a smooth and orderly way. That is why the team are, as we speak, involved in intensive negotiations to do that. We think there's a political will on both sides to do that, and that is the best way, in our view, of meeting the legislation requirements that you set out.
Okay, but if the Prime Minister sends the letter, and he's promised to do that, and you confirm that, and if an extension to the 31st of January is offered, he has promised to accept it, because that's what the court in Scotland was told. Can you explain then how the UK is going to leave the EU on the 31st of October? Because the two things don't square, do they?
Well, I think there's a number of, to quote the Speaker, we'll cross that bridge in due course, is the way the Speaker would usually put it. There's a number of variables that apply to what is a complex piece of legislation, but the first way of meeting the test that you have set out, Mr Benn, through your legislation, is to have a deal, and the full effort of government is focused on that. That is why I was in Luxembourg yesterday. It's why the technical team were in discussions past midnight UK time last night. It's why those discussions are ongoing as we speak, and we are absolutely committed to securing a deal. We think that is in the interest of both sides. Certainly I had 11 bilaterals with counterparts in Luxembourg yesterday. The consistent message in all of those bilateral meetings was a desire on the EU side to have a deal, and that is absolutely what we're focused on delivering.
I understand that entirely. I'm just trying to establish that if no agreement is reached and the Prime Minister sends the letter as he's promised to do and asks for the extension and the EU grants one to the 31st of January, then we can't leave on the 31st of October, can we?
You're, with respect, Chair, as is absolutely your right, but you're, I think, getting several steps ahead. I think the key issue before is are we able to reach an agreement that would satisfy the terms of your legislation if we do so. But these are issues for the House to determine in due course. But what is essential is we reach agreement with the EU, and then the question is whether that is deliverable within the UK Parliament. And that is the test on which we are focused. And I think the other issues which quite understandably you seek to lead me towards are issues for the future. The issue before us today, from a government point of view, is how do we deliver a deal and leave the EU in a smooth and orderly way, because the Prime Minister and the government is absolutely committed to leaving on the 31st of October.
Well, I can understand why you don't want to answer that question, as is your right, but perhaps we could move on. If an agreement is reached, how long do you think it would take to get the WAB and ratification through Parliament?
Well, I think based on your legislation, Chair, it's very clear that this is a House that can move very quickly when it wishes to do so, as we also saw in the legislation from Yvette Cooper. So, as you well know, it is for the House to control in terms of programme motions, in terms of the passage of legislation, and to determine what level of scrutiny it deems relevant. But based on your own legislation, I think it's clear that this is a House that can move very quickly when it wishes to do so. I think it's also the case that the House has shown a desire not to have a no-deal outcome, and therefore, if given an opportunity to vote on a deal and to pass a deal, can move quickly. I'm very aware that it's a significant piece of legislation in the withdrawal agreement bill, but we are confident we can deliver that by the 31st of October.
Right, now the issues that appear to be at the heart of the current negotiations are customs and consent, and I want to take you back to the proposal which the government originally published. It was briefed, it was its best and final offer, clearly it was just its opening offer, but on the question of consent, the proposal the government put forward said that if the Northern Ireland Assembly rejected the common area for agri-food and manufactured goods, then the idea would lapse, and after a year, arrangements would default, and I quote, to existing rules. What existing rules?
Well, what we set out was the position in the letter of the 2nd of October, and as you correctly referred to, Chair, what that did was have a consent, a principle of consent, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves as to why that was there. And that is there because the previous withdrawal agreement bill was voted down 3 times because of concerns raised, including by members of your committee, around the fact that under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it requires the consent of both communities in Northern Ireland, and there was a concern, not just within the DUP, but I think in the wider unionist community, that the backstop did not have that wider consent. And I think there was also a concern in terms of laws applying in Northern Ireland over which people would not have a say. And therefore, in the package of proposals the Prime Minister has brought forward, reflecting, if one goes back to 2017 and the Commission's own mandate to be creative and flexible on the border of Northern Ireland, it reflected that flexibility by addressing many of the challenges that I and others have heard in capitals around the flow of agricultural goods north-south. That is why there was the proposal on the regulatory zone, but it needed to be covered with the principle of consent in order to address why Parliament had rejected this 3 times previously.
Indeed, and I do understand that, Secretary of State, but my question was, you said in the explanatory note that if that arrangement were rejected by the Assembly, then arrangements would default to existing rules. And I'm asking you to explain to the committee what existing rules, because at that point we would have left the European Union. So what are the existing rules that arrangements would default to?
Well, the existing rules one would default to in that instance would be the same rules that would apply if we left in the event of no deal.
So that would involve customs checks, regulatory checks, and the whole...
In that instance, so if consent was withdrawn, that would be the case. Now, the question that would arise as to how feasible would one expect that to be, and the question then is, in the timescale, how much divergence would one have expected over that period of time? The likelihood is extremely little. Would consent have been withdrawn when the European Parliament ratifies after the UK Parliament and could therefore see whether the legislation had been supported in the passage of the bill? But what you draw me into, and these are obviously issues of live discussion, is the mechanism through which consent would operate. And I think the more important issue today is, in terms of the package of discussion, is around the principle of consent, because it is the principle that needs to address why this legislation failed 3 times previously. Now, it is for the negotiation, and you said at the outset, Chair, that there will be areas which I think I hope colleagues can understand of deep sensitivity, given that these are live negotiations going on as we speak, in terms of the mechanism that would apply. But the wider point in terms of today is that the legislation failed 3 times because of concerns around its democratic nature, and therefore there needs to be consent as a principle to address that.
I said to you, I understand that very clearly from the document you produced, but you have confirmed to us that if that were to be the proposal finally agreed, and if the Assembly declined to adopt those proposals, it would result in a hard border. That is correct, isn't it?
But and we're into the details of the mechanism. So it is the case that if consent, well, firstly, if there was no deal, then leaving on no deal would inevitably mean that these issues would crystallise immediately. So a starting point is to have an agreement means that these issues are not crystallising on the 1st of November. But the point is, I think, more widely, and I think is recognised, that what was of concern to the House previously was the lack of consent over the application of laws in Northern Ireland over which people didn't have a say, and the fact that one of the two communities was not in agreement. Yeah. So the question then is, how do you design a mechanism that addresses
I say to you, I understand that, but how could the government propose something that, if the consent was not granted, would result in a hard border when the government has consistently said its policy is to keep the border as it is now? I don't understand.
We have been consistent. When you talk about hard border, that would be coming, if that arose on the EU side, we have been absolutely consistent in our commitment to no infrastructure at the border in Northern Ireland. The proposals we have set forward, if you look at the first item of the 5 set out by the Prime Minister, it reaffirms the government's commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And part of that commitment is that there will be no infrastructure put up on the border in Northern Ireland. And that is a position that the previous government took. That is a position the current Prime Minister has been very clear on.
But it was the government's policy, I don't know whether it still is, that customs checks could take place, but away from the border, either at premises or other designated locations. Is that correct? That was the proposal.
Well, that wasn't just a position of the UK government. At Strasbourg, the Commission also accepted the principle of alternative arrangements, and that was something that both...
What's that?
I'm just wondering what we're doing here. I mean, you've had the floor now for 20 minutes. I doubt there's any other member will have the floor for 20 minutes during this discussion this morning. And I would welcome an opportunity for others to speak.
Yes, I mean, others will all get
it. You know, with respect, rather biased because you're pushing the BENAC through, so I'd personally like to see the chair as well.
Well, your comments are noted. The final question I want to ask, before I bring other members in, is turning now to the government's wish for a Canada-style free trade agreement. Can you confirm that if that were what were to transpire, that it would involve customs checks and regulatory checks and rules of origin checks?
Well, it's absolutely the case that we are committed to Northern Ireland coming out of the EU customs union, right. And to having, and we may get into questions around the political declaration and our commitment to a best-in-class free trade agreement. We're also committed, as the Prime Minister set out in his letter, to minimising any checks that are required. You'll be very well aware that, particularly on manufactured goods, for example, it's only a very low percentage of goods that are checked in any event. You'll be aware that we start from a position of regulatory alignment based on over 40 years of membership of the EU. So again, we start to stray into questions of detail, but it is a point of law that if you have two customs unions, then obviously one needs to balance how the trade flows between those two.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Andrea Jenkins.
As someone who's been a great critic of the government's approach to Brexit, I have to say, since Prime Minister Boris Johnson's took the role, I think he's doing a fantastic job, and his approach to Brexit and ensuring that the referendum result is respected. Number one, how would you say the approach to negotiations has changed since the previous Prime Minister to now? How has your role changed and how has the approach changed?
Well, my role has changed insofar as previously I was much more focused on the preparation for no deal. That is now led by the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, who I know has given evidence to the committee on that issue. And my focus has been on the negotiations. So in terms of within government, there has been a change. I think from a government point of view, the change of approach, I would refer you back to the letter sent by the Prime Minister to President Tusk in the summer, which set out the changes that the Prime Minister was seeking to make to the deal. But as someone who served both Prime Ministers, what would I say? I would say both have shown an absolute commitment to securing a deal. And that is very much what is informing the current Prime Minister's approach.
Thank you, Minister. And just finally, do you believe the Benn Act has weakened the negotiating hand of the government and our country?
I think it has been unhelpful to the negotiations, absolutely. But I think what is recognised both in the EU and the UK is the time is now for a deal. I think there is, certainly reflecting in the discussions I had yesterday, there is a desire to get a deal, a recognition that it is in both sides' interests to do so, and the teams are working extremely hard in order to take that forward.
Splendid, thank you very much. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you a little bit about the consequences if there isn't a deal and if the UK leaves the EU without a deal, which is clearly, as we speak, still on the cards? Operation Yellowhammer warned that food and medicine shortages would result from long delays at Dover, if there were long delays at Dover. This morning, the National Audit Office has told us that the government currently expects cross-channel flows to be between 45% to 65% of current levels on day one of a no-deal Brexit because of two factors, and we've taken evidence about these in recent weeks. One is the lack of trader readiness, combined with a limited space in French ports to hold unready lorries. What, in your view, would a reduction of cross-channel flows by at least a third, 35% to 65%, we're told is the current government estimate, what would a reduction of cross-channel flows on that scale mean in practice in the UK?
Yeah. So I saw that NAO report as well, and I think what was heartening for government within it was the recognition that significant improvements have been made, and the government has done a huge amount of work on this. That's reflected, for example, in the 900 or so Border Force officers that have been recruited, the £108 million of funding that's been allocated, the public awareness campaign, the automatic allocation of ERE numbers to businesses, the 1.5 million letters that have gone out, and so forth. And the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, I'm sure, could give evidence of a whole range of things that have been done. To give you perhaps an illustration, because obviously I'm much more focused on the negotiations than Yellowhammer, but if I go back to when I was involved in this, I remember a report back in November that talked about a 10% increase in food prices. That's how it was always portrayed in Parliament. Actually, the figure was 5 to 10%. It's 30% of our food that is imported from the EU, 50% is sourced in the UK, 20% rest of the world. Of that 30%, it was based on a border assumption that was far worse than the one, Mr Timms, that you have just quoted. It assumed a currency devaluation, which I think is at odds with what most people would now envisage. And so my point being is that you often get these figures quoted that are not reflective of the circumstances, even reflected in your own question with the border flow, that don't reflect the work that the subcommittee XO, chaired by CDL, has done, meeting 5 times a week throughout the summer. That doesn't mean that we're in any way complacent, that there will be challenges and disruption. I was at the port of Rotterdam last week, discussing with them the massive amount of work that has been done. Because it's, again, parliamentary-wise, we tend to talk about Calais a lot, whereas actually there's a huge amount of goods coming in through the other ports, the container ports in particular. So we are very aware that there are challenges. The NEO themselves recognised a huge amount of work has been done, and that work is very much ongoing.
No, the NEO does recognise the work that's been done. I think over the summer we were told that the expectation was that trade flows would be 40 to 60% cross-channel, and they're now projected, this is the government assumption, we're told by the NEO, is 45 to 65%. So that's clearly an improvement, but it's still a very dramatic reduction in cross-channel flows. In a speech in Madrid last month, you made the point, absolutely rightly, I think, that if indeed there were 2.5 days of delays at Calais, then the impact of that would not solely be felt within the UK, and I think you were right to say that. But what do you think the impact would be in the UK if there were 2.5 days of delay at at Calais?
Well, I'd say two things. I think, firstly, the message I got from businesses and leaders in Spain was the same as in Poland and elsewhere, which is they don't believe that it will be 2.5 days, and they're set to work with us to ensure that we have as smooth a flow of goods as possible. I mean, to give you an example from Poland, a huge amount of fresh poultry, 84,000 jobs in Poland in the poultry industry. If you're a delay in terms of fresh poultry, obviously that is hugely significant in terms of their flows in. So the point I was making in Madrid is that there is a massive shared desire to get a deal. That is what we're focusing on today, and that is shared by EU capitals and by the Commission, that it is a win-win for us to have a deal, and that's what we're working on. But if there is the situation of no deal, then it will be in the mutual interest of both sides to mitigate that as best as possible. And I think you referred to Madrid. Madrid was really just giving some colour to that.
I mean, Operation Yellowhammer said that delays of that order would lead to shortages of some fresh foods and medicines in the UK. That is the case, isn't it? That is the government's expectation if we have delays of the kind of order you were talking about in Madrid.
But that's why I'm saying I don't think there will be those delays. But of course, if there's a delay to goods coming in, and if you take my example of fresh poultry as an example, that is damaging. The question is there a will on the EU side to work with us? Yes, that's partly why, as in places like the Port of Rotterdam, discussing that, and we have those discussions with EU members. But ultimately, this is why both sides see the benefit of reaching a deal, and the challenge in the next 24, 48 hours is how we work together to achieve that.
I understand. The National Audit Office is saying the current government expectation is that flows across the Channel, including Rotterdam, all of them, would be 45 to 65% of current levels on just after a no-deal Brexit. That does mean very long delays at Dover and Calais, doesn't it?
Well, as I've sought to do, Mr. Timms, a huge amount of work is going on to mitigate those delays. We can go through the steps that EXO has taken. For example, the 31 million that it's allocated to boost customs agents to increase automation, postponing of the accounting of import VAT, reaccession to the Common Transit Convention.
But the benefits
so there's a work stream in government. The point is, it is in both sides' interests to avoid that if it arises, but the far better way of mitigating that is through a deal, and we are absolutely committed to working with a deal. And I think if one looks at comments made by EU leaders in recent days, it's very clear there is a shared desire, both in EU capitals, in the Commission, and within the UK, to reach a deal.
Just one other aspect, if I may, Chair, if we did leave the EU without a deal, the Revenue and Customs told us last week that the administrative burden of completing customs declarations for all EU trade in goods movements on both sides of the EU border would be £15 billion per year. I think we can all remember when the Conservative Party, I think rightly, used to be very sensitive to extra burdens on business counted in the millions. Here we've got a forecast of billions in additional red tape burdens. Wouldn't burdens on that scale be catastrophic for many UK businesses?
Well, as a former Treasury Minister, Mr. Timms, I know you, as I do, listen very closely to the wishes of the business community. And the best way of addressing, whether it's the figure you quote or a different figure, the best way of addressing this is through a deal and a clear message, whether it's the letter in the Telegraph this morning from business leaders or whether it is the numerous conversations and I'm sure you have, with business leaders up and down the country. The very clear message one gets from business is they want to see a deal. And I think if we are able to bring a deal back to the House, I think the key question for all members of Parliament is whether it is in the national interest to support a deal, to ensure the flow of goods is maintained, to deliver an implementation period, to safeguard the aspects of the withdrawal agreement I'm sure you would agree with, like citizens' rights. And that will be the question that members of the House need to address.
If we did have a no-deal Brexit and there was that kind of additional burden, would the government take steps to mitigate the billions of extra red tape burdens?
Well, if my whole focus is on trying to secure a deal, that is what I've worked throughout the summer on, it's what I'm working on now, it is what the Prime Minister, it's what David Frost and the entire government is focused on getting the deal. And because I have said, when I've been before this committee previously sometimes, slightly to annoyance of one or two of my colleagues, that a no deal is disruptive, and I have always supported a deal. We can get into detail as to how disruptive a no deal is, but the reality is a deal is a far better outcome for the United Kingdom. And I think the question will come to members of Parliament who to date have not supported a deal is whether they are now willing to do so, because I think that is the way we respond to the concerns of business, but also we actually move the country forward.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. When Michael Gove sat there a few weeks ago, he was asked whether, if there was such a scenario in which Theresa May's deal came back to the House of Commons, would he vote for it? And like a shot, he said he would. Would you?
He said yes. I read the transcript last night. so I think he said yes. I voted it 3 times, so yes.
Okay. What makes you think that the deal that's currently being negotiated is substantially better than the deal that was previously negotiated?
Well, I think first and foremost because I think the deal will be deliverable. And the key issue with the previous deal was the House of Commons rejected it 3 times. And I think there have been, in my discussions with the EU, 2 central issues. The first is whether we can agree a deal that addresses the mutual concerns and equities of the 2 sides. But then the second question they say to me is, and will it be deliverable in the House of Commons? Perfectly legitimate question. And I think the key issue that came out of the debates, and I know Mr Crabb, you spoke in many of them, was the concerns around the backstop, and for reasons we've already touched on. And that, in terms of the letter that the Prime Minister sent to President Tusk in the summer, was particularly focused in on that issue, distinct from the Northern Ireland Protocol as a whole. So, for example, the Common Travel Area, the Single Electricity Market, North-South cooperation within the protocol is distinct from the backstop elements. So we have addressed that, but also I think what the Prime Minister has done is be very clear in terms of the future relationship that he is seeking in terms of a best-in-class free trade agreement. And I think that therefore gives colleagues across the House the opportunity then to move forward.
Okay. If you feel that the current direction of negotiations are leading to a better deal than the one that was previously negotiated by Theresa May, what do you think was it that made members of the ERG group who were briefed in Downing Street last night so angry?
Well, I mean, I was travelling back from Luxembourg last night in order to attend today's committee. I've always, Chair, I think, tried to be a regular attender of your committees. So obviously I wasn't in for that meeting. I can't, therefore, given that I wasn't there, Mr Crabb, speculate on what was said or was not said.
Is it fair to say that we're broadly moving in the direction of a Northern Ireland specific backstop as opposed to a UK-wide backstop, which was, of course, the big concern and stumbling block in the previous agreement?
Well, again, I mean, one doesn't want to get into sort of the detail of negotiations that are ongoing, but what was the 5th pillar of the Prime Minister's letter to President Juncker on the 2nd of October was making it very clear the importance of the UK, the United Kingdom leaving, as he has repeatedly said in the Chamber, whole and entire. And I think that is absolutely fundamental to the government's approach, and that is a point we've made very clear.
But that characteristic which you described of leaving entirely and as one, within that, do you accept that it's now the government's position that for Brexit to be meaningful for the UK, Northern Ireland will inevitably be treated slightly differently?
Well, what I've made it clear is that the sovereignty of the United Kingdom needs to be respected. The Prime Minister has been very clear in terms of the importance of that vis-à-vis the customs union. And again, I think I'd refer back to the comments that he's made on that point.
Okay. And look, just finally, Mr Chairman, we obviously wish you well in the days ahead. If it does look like we can get a deal in the coming days, and it looks like we will need a bit more time to do the legalese around it, would you be comfortable with a short technical extension to get it done?
No, I think it is important that we leave on the 31st of October. I think the House has demonstrated through the Benn legislation, through the Cooper legislation, its ability to legislate in a quick manner. I think many of these issues have been discussed. I think the one issue that most people don't feel is that the House of Commons hasn't discussed Brexit or the withdrawal agreement on enough occasions. I think the issues are very well known to colleagues, and I think the important thing is, and particularly as I say when I listen to the voices of business and also to many constituents and citizens, they want to get Brexit done. They want the country to move forward. They want to do so in a smooth and orderly way. That is the opportunity we have.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Craig McKinley.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to concentrate on the political declaration and what is happening on that at the moment. I mean, one of the reasons that many of us were very concerned about Theresa May's withdrawal agreement was some looseness of words, but the sort of seeming direction of travel to us seemed to be perpetual vassalage, building upon the customs territory, high alignment on all manner of things, and of course that very woolly word of best endeavours, which can mean different things to different people. So I was very pleased to see in the Prime Minister's letter of 2nd of October to President Juncker, and I'll just quote one of the final paragraphs. Together with finalisation of the necessary changes to the political declaration reflecting the goal of a comprehensive free trade agreement. Now that was very welcome, and it was the first time we'd really seen a clear statement from the government that was the direction of travel that we'd like to see. So obviously that, putting aside the issues on the island of Ireland, that is very similar to what Donald Tusk offered in March 2018. Now, how is progress from the government, UK government side, how is that being perceived, trying to flesh out that high-level free trade agreement? How is that being perceived by the EU side at the moment?
Well, I think there's a shared desire to get on to the future relationship. I think that is something that both sides recognise is the best way forward. I think what is often lost in this process is the fact that we have been debating for a very long time now the winding down provisions and not actually the future trade agreement. There's obviously an interplay between that agreement and also the other trade deals that the Department for International Trade and Liz Truss will be looking to secure. And so there is a shared desire to get onto the future economic partnership and to have those discussions. And again, that is why I think the time is now for us to agree what is, in essence, the winding down provisions enable us to get onto those trade talks.
I've always thought one of the Brexit dividends is the ability to make new free trade deals around the world. And I know, I believe that's the Prime Minister's ambition as well. So when the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and yourself have said that if Theresa May's withdrawal agreement were back, you would agree to that, given that it would be a distinctive hindrance to those international trade deals because we'd have very little to offer in terms of access to our markets and differences in regulatory alignments. Do you still stand by that? Would you honestly still vote for Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, given that I know you to be an international free trader and know the benefits of global free trade for just the general direction of the health of nations? So I'm concerned that there are anyone left in the government that actually still is an adherent to that old deal.
Well, without wanting to rerun previous debates that we've had on the committee, of course, what was said to me at the time was, on the one hand, the political declaration didn't have legal force and therefore was a worthless set of commitments, and yet at the same time it was binding on issues like security, cooperation, or its constraint in terms of trade deals, and notwithstanding the linkage between Article 184 and the political declaration, obviously there's an inherent contradiction within that position. So, but I don't think it's helpful for us to go back over old ground. I think the key issue is the Prime Minister has been very clear in terms of what future economic partnership he is seeking. It is a best-in-class free trade agreement. What do we mean by that? It means that it's not just about applying CETA, but it's looking at what precedent there is from the EU in terms of trade deals they have done around the world and seeking to build on that. But it is also signalling our desire for a close security relationship as well, as part of being, as the Prime Minister set out in his conference speech, a European country with European values that geographically remains extremely close to Europe, that does a very sizable proportion of its trade with Europe and wants to get onto that positive future relationship. And the issue before us is the winding down provision before we get on to the debate on the future economic partnership, on which I'm sure the House will wish to have a view in due course.
Just finally, the government is exuding positivity about a new political declaration. Are you sensing that the other side now finally get it as the destination that they've offered in the past? Do they seem to be amenable to what we're suggesting to them on the political declaration, whether it's enforceable or not, which is, of course, another matter?
Sure. Well, I mean, as you would expect me to say, Mr. Kinley, it is a negotiation, and both sides have equities within that. We haven't got into the debate, for example, on areas like level playing field and how that interplays, but the EU will have legitimate areas of interest that they will want to protect, as is quite proper. But the point that I was signalling is, as the Prime Minister has set out, is our commitment to have a best-in-class free trade agreement, and a big part of that is the global approach that we want to have in terms of other trade deals with other countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pat McFadden.
Thanks for coming. I want to ask you a few questions about these level playing field provisions, if I may. In the withdrawal agreement as it stands, at Annex 4, Part 3, there's what's called a non-regression of labour and social standards clause. It says, the Union and the UK shall ensure the level of protection provided for by law, regulation and practices is not reduced below the level provided by the common standards applicable within the Union and the UK at the end of the transition period in the area of labour and social protection, fundamental rights at work, occupational health and safety, fair working conditions and so on. There's a similar clause on the previous page relating to environmental standards. Yet in the memo issued by the government on the 2nd of October, paragraph 4, it says there is therefore no need for the extensive level playing field arrangements envisaged in the previous protocol. Can you explain to us why the government now wants to depart from those previous commitments in the withdrawal agreement to level playing field clauses on labour, social standards, environmental protections, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, you raise an important issue, and I think the key principle I would start with when looking at level playing field is what is the outcome one is seeking, and there are different ways of achieving that. Now, if you look at the Queen's speech, where the Prime Minister set out our desire to be best in class on environmental standards, his very strong wish to have global leadership on that and to have a number of areas where we have a very strong regulatory standard on the environment. If you look at historically within the UK in a whole range of areas has been ahead of Europe. I mean, the two obvious ones would be on maternity rights and parental leave. And I don't think there's any desire within the House to have, it's actually the former Chancellor in a speech to De Bilde who talked about Singapore on the Thames, but I don't think there is any desire to have a deregulatory approach. The question is, to what extent do you have sovereign control of your regulation, and to what is the interplay between your regulatory commitments and your market access, and that has long been a feature of trade deals, and that will be, I'm sure, part of the discussion with the EU moving forward.
But the fact is, legally speaking, the government's intention is no longer to have the commitments that I read out from Annex 4 in the future. That's just a factual position.
Well, it's part of the negotiation, obviously, to discuss, but I would refer you back to a slide that Task Force 50 themselves produced, which showed what they had, which was basically a staircase, which was the linkage on their slide between market access and regulatory commitments. And I mean, that is a feature if you look at the commitments within CETA. That is also the case in terms of the interplay between access and regulatory commitments. I mean, that is part of a trade deal. The more fundamental point is the government is not looking to deregulate. The Queen's speech gives evidence of that approach. But it is the case, as part of a best-in-class free trade agreement, that gives a clarity, whereas the previous political declaration was wider in scope, and therefore that is part of the discussion that we can have.
Well, let me turn to the similar paragraph in the political declaration. You've confirmed, as far as the withdrawal agreement goes, you want to replace these paragraphs which I've been referring to, and not to have those non-regression commitments. But looking forward to the future relationship, the political declaration as of the moment, at paragraph 79 says, the future relationship must ensure fair and open competition. Provisions to ensure this should cover state aid, competition, social and employment standards, environmental standards, climate change, relevant tax matters, building on the level playing field arrangements, which we just discussed, which will no longer apply, provided for in the withdrawal agreement. So, again, is that text which in an amended future political declaration the government is now seeking to change or to remove that paragraph?
No, well, you mentioned state aid, for example, so let me give you an example. The UK currently spends 0.4% GDP on state aid. The EU average is 0.8%. Germany spends 1.3%. But it is perfectly in order for, as part of the negotiation, for there to be a discussion as to what is the balanced approach on areas such as level playing field. I mean, that is a part of the negotiation. Now, again, you wouldn't expect me today, as we are in the middle of a negotiation, to get into the detail of that negotiation. But where the balance lies and how that is assessed is part of a normal negotiation in the course of these things. But if you look at our starting point, the UK is not a country that has abused state aid, and that is reflected by the position. So the idea that we would use state aid to advantage our businesses at the expense of those in Europe is belied by what the current data shows.
What I'm trying to establish by way of text is whether the government is seeking to change the provision that Theresa May's government had signed up to under the paragraph I've read out. Are you seeking to change that commitment?
Well, as I say, I'm not going to get into the detail of the negotiation. What I'm saying is what matters on commitments around level playing field is the balance of that and the outcome that is being sought, and there are different ways of achieving that.
Can I just try one final question with you? In terms of the paragraphs that I've read out from the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration about the future, if there is new text on those things which cover level playing field provisions on social and environmental standards, labour standards and so on, will Parliament see that new text before being asked to vote on any revised deal?
Well, again, I mean, that refers to the discussion we had at the start. But I am very alive, Mr McFadden, not least from the talks we had with the Labour front bench in terms of the interest that there is across the House from members around the commitments. What I'm, without getting into the detail of negotiation signaling this morning, is the government, as reflected in the Queen's speech, is not a government looking to deregulate its environmental standards or in other areas. but it is right as part of giving clarity as under the best-in-class free trade agreement that the text reflects that, and that is a point of negotiation that we're discussing.
If there's no desire to depart from the level playing field, why not sign up to it? I mean, this does matter a great deal to, I'll say to Labour MPs, possibly to MPs from other parties, but it certainly matters a great deal to Labour MPs. And
well,
do you understand the concerns that would arise on the Labour benches if the government resiles from these paragraphs that I've read out?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I hear the point.
Okay. Jonathan Ginocchia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just picking up on Pat McFadden's points, just for clarification, really. Under the new political declaration, did I pick up that we would be moving to a Canada-type approach when it comes to negotiating a new FTA? Did you actually say that?
Say again, sorry, Mr.
We would move to a Canada approach when it comes to negotiating the new FTA.
No, what I said is that the Prime Minister has sought changes to the backstop in the withdrawal agreement specifically due to the fact that the previous agreement failed 3 times and that was central to that issue. And that in that will have consequential changes within the political declaration as a result of that. And that secondly, that in seeking a best-in-class free trade agreement, that likewise enables a discussion as part of the negotiation as to how that is best reflected in the political declaration.
So let's say, for instance, a Canada-style deal is put into the political declaration, or for this purpose, any other particular formula. Would that actually be binding, or would it just be a declaration pointing the way that could, for instance, be changeable by a future administration?
Well, again, on the one hand, I'm told that political declaration doesn't have force. On the other hand, I'm told that it is binding.
I'm asking
in its
you.
kind of constraints. So whether there is a good faith commitment and the linkage through Article 5 in terms of good faith, Article 184 in terms of the interplay between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and so they do sit as a package. But the point is, within that, then there will need to be a negotiation. And as Mr. McFadden's question alluded to, within that, there are a number of other factors that are dealt with in the round. These aren't dealt with in silos. And you asked the first question on Canada Plus. When I sort of said, actually, it wasn't about strictly putting in Canada Plus, it's about best in class, then they say, well, assuming we put in Canada Plus, the point is it will be for the negotiation. Now, as part of that, for example, I will want to speak very closely with the devolved administrations, who will have a view. The House as a whole will have a view. It depends whether it's the same House of Commons or, more likely after the general election, a different House of Commons, and how that will wish to express its view. The point is, this will be the future negotiation that is still to come. The challenge is how we get on to that, and the challenge therefore is in the coming days is, can we actually agree a withdrawal agreement and get on to that future relationship? Because if we can't, the issue of the political declaration becomes academic.
Now, I understand that, Secretary of State, and that's kind of what I was trying to get on to, because a lot of the Labour MP's questions this morning have been based around, why isn't there stuff in there? But wouldn't it be true that, I mean, if this deal is passed with the political declaration, the Labour Party can then stand in a general election and say, if we're elected, we're going to put in all the stuff that Pat McFadden was just asking for?
Well, given that the negotiation is to come into December 2020, and I think most of us can agree there'll be a general election a long way before December 2020, then clearly a future government, notwithstanding any constraints that flow from the withdrawal agreement through into the package, so notwithstanding that, because that is an international treaty, will then have discretion and certainly can go further in its commitments by all means. But the point,
the point I'm making is that Labour MPs aren't losing anything by voting for the deal, because well, I think they need to explain why, because they could ask for it at a later date.
Well, absolutely. A Labour government can make further commitments, and I've alluded to areas where previous UK parliaments have indeed made further commitments, such as on maternity rights, where we have legislated to be on greenhouse gas by 2050. Again, that is a decision the UK Parliament has taken.
Slightly changing the topic, what are the risks to electricity consumers in Northern Ireland and Ireland if the single electricity market cannot be maintained?
The single electricity market and the benefits thereof were specifically mentioned in the letter the Prime Minister sent. That is a part of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the intention is for that to continue.
So there would be significant risks if it didn't continue?
Would there be significant risk?
Yes.
Well, the issue that would apply, so if you're then pivoting away from a deal to a no deal, the issue, I don't think, I mean, again, this is more the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster's remit. The issue would be more around the legal underpinning of those contracts rather than the day one supply, not least given, obviously, Great Britain supplies significant amounts of gas to Ireland as part of that interplay. And the point around connectivity, the connectors as well, probably the best example is it's less an Ireland one, but it's more from an EU perspective, which is the beast from the east. The issue with the beast from the east was it hit Europe at the start of the week, it hit the UK the second half of the week. It's in both sides' interests to have the security of supply, but also the lowering of cost from the connectivity that there is. And that's why I think there is a desire on both sides on things like the single electricity market that obviously is, by its essence, very interconnected to ensure that continues.
Are you saying that contingency plans, if there wasn't to be an agreement, are not your area?
When I was doing it, I met from memory. It was, memory it was in June. I met with the chief exec of National Grid, chief exec of Centrica, chief exec of Energy UK, all of whom were very close to this issue. All of whom were confident that we would be well placed on this matter, but very happy to refer it to CDL for the latest position.
Thank you. Why did the explanatory note to the UK proposals for an amended protocol specify that the single electricity market should be subject to the consent procedure?
Because it would involve the ECJ having a continued involvement in terms of the SAM, and therefore the discussion at the time was in that context regarding the reach of the ECJ.
So you don't believe that that's going to overly complicate the two countries of Ireland having a working electricity system?
No, I think there's as I say, I mean, it's an issue that CDL is leading on now, rather than myself. It isn't a feature of the negotiations. But in terms of, I think, both in Northern Ireland and from the Irish government, there is a common desire to see the arrangements continue. I think a recognition that is in the interest of consumers on both sides in terms of continuity of supply and price. And, as I say, very happy to get an update for you on it.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State, the EU has trade agreements with around 70 partners, as I know you'll be aware, and under those trade agreements the UK does they account for about 14 to 15% of UK trade in goods, and obviously these range from larger economies such as Japan and South Korea and on to smaller economies. Now these EU agreements are expected to no longer apply to the UK at the end of transition period, or they would stop applying on day one if we were to leave with no deal. My understanding is the government has intended to see some rollover of these, and there's been some progress, I think it's on the government website, agreements with Chile, Iceland, Norway, Lebanon, Palestinian Authority, South Korea. But there are 23 countries, approximately, with whom there are agreements that still need to be rolled over. That includes Japan and Turkey. There seems to be some guidance that the government's producing. It's not in the government's intention to transition all the agreements in their entirety. Could you explain, is that because they're not considered necessary or because it doesn't see it as possible?
Well, I think I draw a distinction between continuity deals by trade and others. Again, this is something CDL is leading on within the sphere of no deal. But when I was looking at it, I think that the two distinctions I would draw on is first the distinction between the number of deals and the percentage of value. And the top 5 trading partners represented 74% of the current trade. So there's a distinction between just the numbers. And you mentioned 23, but one of the things to look at if we're looking at trade is the percentage of value affixed to those deals as opposed to just the number of them. I think more widely in terms of some of the deals...
Value for the nation as a whole as opposed to individual sectors.
Yeah, so are you talking purely about trade or are you talking about continuity of EU agreements more widely?
I'm talking about the impact for the UK, so primarily UK trade.
So purely on the trade deals. So as I say, I think that would be something CDL would need to update you on. But the key ones have been done, like Switzerland, which represents alone a fifth of the economic value. So the key ones have done. In terms of where the tail is of those trade deals, then that is something CDL would need to update the committee on.
So in relation to Japan, Canada and Turkey, there are delays in reaching agreement?
As I say, I mean, I have been completely focused, as I hope you would appreciate, on the negotiations and not on the trade continuity deals as part of the no-deal planning. There is a meeting that meets 5 days a week, chaired by CDL, Cabinet Committees XO, that has these items as part of its standing item. Because I've been travelling quite a bit, I haven't been able to attend that, so other ministers from the department attend. So where we are on that, Switzerland was, from memory, 20% of the trade value. That was done some time ago. And I think the majority have been done. Obviously, we've had additional time since March, because I think you and I had a debate on this at a previous select committee, from memory. And at that time, the percentage was lower. And obviously we used the time since the 29th of March in order to progress them further.
Would you be aware of what is causing the delay with Japan, Canada and Turkey?
From my recollection, Canada had been dealt with, so when you say there's a delay with Canada in particular, but as I say, I mean, I've been focused on other issues, and it will be for CDL to update the committee on that.
So would you say it's the government's intention to try to roll back or to try to roll over with each country all aspects of the EU's agreements under which UK businesses are currently trading?
It's the government's intention to get a deal, and that will give us the implementation period. And through the implementation period, we will obviously then have the rollover of these trade deals. The question to which you're referring is in the event of no deal. And as part of our preparation for no deal, continuity of agreements have been put in place. That has been done, as I say, prioritising the biggest trade deals by value, Canada being first and foremost within those. It's a very legitimate point you raise as to what extent is there a tail of any outstanding, but I know we have used the time since March in order to address that.
One point on Canada, and there may be subsequent to this, but what was Canada's approach to rolling over its EU trade agreement for the UK if there is no deal?
What, sorry, say again?
Canada, in the event of no deal, what was Canada's position?
Well, Canada was I think, the one on which there had been most delay when I was looking at it before. Switzerland, as I say, was the one that dealt with 20%, and we had dealt with Switzerland.
Were there discussions with Canada? Because didn't Canada suggest that they would not be rolling over their EU trade agreement for the UK in the event of no deal?
Well, as I say, I refer to CDL as to what the latest position is with Canada. I know when you and I debated this At a previous hearing, Canada was one of the ones that was outstanding. We had done, as I say, the leading ones such as Switzerland. As to where that is, obviously there's an interplay in terms of the temporary tariff regime, which is up to 12 months.
Forgive me, Secretary of State, but you have just told us that you have been involved in preparing for no deal. You have sought to reassure the country that things would be okay in the event of no deal. And I'm struggling to get an even basic response, clear response on this. And there are businesses in my constituency, and I've
with respect,
before,
I said
one
business
business may trade with many countries through several of these EU trade agreements. So what exactly is in place should there be no deal for businesses in your constituency, in my constituency, trading under many of these trade agreements? What will happen to those businesses?
Well, with respect, I actually say the exact opposite of that, which is that my focus has been on the negotiations, which is why CDL has been leading this in terms of trade continuity as part of his contingency planning, working with Liz Truss in terms of the DIT, and they will have the latest position. I'm very happy to write to you on that. As I say, when I was looking at it, which is quite a few months ago, we had made considerable progress with areas like Switzerland, which represented a fifth by value. We'd also put in place a whole load of other ones. Canada was one of the ones at that point on which there'd been some issues, but it will be for CDL, and I'll ask CDL to write to you with an update.
Could I ask one final question, very quick question, Chair? Thank you very much. Could I ask what the message from business has been in relation to the rolling over of EU trade agreements, and whether there's been any feedback?
Yeah, there has, which is the feedback from business is for us to get a deal.
No, on the EU trade agreements. I know you and I can both say it's to get a deal. I mean, that's sort of goes without saying that everybody would want a deal and a good deal, etc., etc. But in terms of your policy, the government's policy around transitioning trade agreements, and whether that is done in their entirety, which doesn't seem to be the government's intention from the government's own updated guidance, what has been the feedback from business?
Well, as I say, I think we have made good progress in ensuring we roll over the trade agreements in a no-deal scenario with third countries. Obviously, the EU is the most significant trade deal. The best way of doing that is through a deal. That is what I've been focused on. You raise quite properly the issue in terms of Canada specifically, and we are working closely with Canada to mitigate any impact, but I will ask CDL to give you a specific update in respect of Canada.
Okay. Thank you very much. Joanna Cherry.
Can we... Good morning, Secretary of State.
Morning.
Can we just go back to the court case in which I and others were involved in Scotland and the undertakings that you outlined earlier? The Prime Minister has undertaken three things: to comply with his obligations under the Act, to request an extension if Parliament doesn't approve a deal or agree to a no deal by Saturday, and also not to seek to frustrate the purpose of the Act. That's correct, isn't it?
You are a more senior lawyer than I am, and the Prime Minister will have given the undertakings to which I am sure you refer.
Yeah, I'm just reading from the judgment, which I'm sure you've read, and the undertakings including not seeking to frustrate the purpose of the Act.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's correct, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. And the judge also said, and I quote, that if the Prime Minister or the government went back on the assurances given to the court, this would be destructive of one of the core principles of constitutional propriety and of the mutual trust that is the bedrock of the relationship between the court and the Crown. Do you agree with that statement?
It will. You're reading out, I assume, something from the court, are you?
I'm asking you whether you agree with the highest court in Scotland that if the Prime Minister or the government went back on the assurances, the undertakings you've described, it would be, and I quote, destructive of one of the core principles of constitutional propriety and of the mutual trust that is the bedrock of the relationship between the court and the Crown.
I would expect government to stand by undertakings it's given by the court, and the Prime Minister has been very clear at all stages that we will abide by the law.
So you agree with that statement then?
I agree that we will always abide by the law, always abide by the ministerial code, and by undertakings that have been given to the court.
So as a lawyer, you'll know what frustrating the purpose of the Act means.
I would always defer to the Attorney-General to give me I am extremely out of date in my legal analysis as to precise definitions, but I think the underlying principle to which you refer, of course, will be known.
Okay, well, there have been various media reports, and one of your fellow ministers, Andrea Leadsom, has been on television saying that there was an intention to send a letter seeking an extension in terms of the Benn Act, and then send another letter saying, oh, that's not really what we want something else. I'm sure the Attorney-General will have advised you that to do that would be to frustrate the purpose of the Act and therefore to breach the undertakings given to the court. That's right, isn't it?
Well, again, it's not for me to spell out what the Attorney has or has not said, but I think you know the Attorney well. You have praised his integrity in the Chamber quite properly.
I'm not asking about the Attorney-General's advice. I'm asking whether you agree that for the Prime Minister to send a second letter undermining the terms of the first letter would be to frustrate the purpose of the Act. Do you agree with that?
It is. Well, I don't think it is right and proper for me in an evidence session to this committee to get into detailed analysis of the law, interpretations, definitions and otherwise. What I am very clear on as a member of the government is that it's my duty to abide by the law, that we will do so, and the Prime Minister will stand by the commitments he has given to the court.
So is there a plan to send 2 letters?
I'm not aware of any such plan.
If no agreement is reached in the next couple of days, will the Prime Minister put to Parliament on or before Saturday the option of leaving without a deal?
Well, again, as I said at the very outset, and when the Chair probed on these important matters, in terms of what is and is not put to the House, then the proper manner in which that is done is through the Leader of the House, and there will be an opportunity for him to do so tomorrow.
According to the DEGSU website, your responsibilities include working closely with the United Kingdom's devolved administrations. Now, we know, because we've much discussion about Northern Ireland, that there isn't a devolved administration in Northern Ireland just now, but there are devolved administrations in Edinburgh and Cardiff. Can you tell us what liaison you've had with the UK's devolved administrations about the progress of negotiations this week?
This week, I haven't spoken to Jeremy or to Mike this week. One of the ministers within DEGSU went up to Edinburgh to meet with the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government last Thursday as part of his engagement on my behalf. That was because I think from memory I was travelling in Europe that day. In fact, I was travelling over to Brussels for the meeting with Michel Barnier on the Friday. Otherwise, originally it had been in my diary for me to attend, but because of the meeting with Michel Barnier, another minister went on my behalf. But also attending that meeting was the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, again ensuring that there was cabinet engagement with the devolved administrations.
So that was a meeting last week?
That was on Thursday.
Yeah. So am I to understand that there has been no liaison by your department or indeed by the government with either the Welsh or the Scottish administrations this week about the progress of the negotiations?
I'd have to check with the ministerial team. I've been in, as I say, I've been travelling a lot over the last couple of days as to where the engagement is. There's a lot of engagement also done at official level, and one of the things I did following actually previous session at this committee was change the guidance for officials within my own department on their engagement with the devolved administrations to increase the level of official engagement, because I felt...
I'm not really talking about official engagement, forgive me, we're short on time. I'm talking about ministerial engagement, because you see, we've seen the Democratic Unionist Party and the ERG being in and out of Downing Street this week, being kept apprised of how things are progressing. I'd like to know whether you're able to tell us whether there has been any ministerial engagement with either my colleagues in the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government about the progress of these negotiations this week, because the public can see that the DUP and the ERG are being kept closely advised. But so far as I am aware, the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, democratically elected by the people of Scotland and Wales, are out of the loop. Now, can you, I realise you've been backwards and forwards to Luxembourg, but I think you would agree with me, it'd be quite a serious matter if the DUP and the ERG were in the loop, but the Scottish and the Welsh governments were not in the loop. So if you're not able to answer today and give me that comfort, could you possibly write a letter to the chair of the committee to confirm whether or not the Welsh and Scottish governments are in the loop?
I'm very happy to. I know that I was due to have had a call with Jeremy and Mike on Saturday that unfortunately had to be postponed. But within the last week, ministers within DEXU and the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster and others travelled up to Edinburgh as part of our engagement. So I think when you've got ministers actually going up to Edinburgh within the last week as part of our engagement,
but yesterday,
it is slightly...
Minister, yesterday, Secretary of State, and the day before, the DUP and the ERG were in and out of number 10 Downing Street. I'm not talking about last week. We all know things have moved quite fast this week. A bit like a yo-yo, right enough, but you're being very clear there have been important developments this week. So I'm not really interested in what happened last week. I'm not interested in the fact that a very junior minister phoned the Scottish Government at the last minute on Monday morning to say what was in the Queen's speech. What I want to know is what engagement there has been with the Scottish and Welsh governments about the progress of the negotiations this week. It is my suspicion that there has been none. And I'd like you to be able to put my mind at rest that there has been some. Now, I accept that you've been travelling backwards and forwards. You may not be able to answer that question, but it would be good if you could answer it at a later date, because I think voters in Scotland and Wales will be keen to know that their governments have been kept apprised of what's going on in terms of your department's responsibilities.
Yeah, I'm very happy to write to you with an update, but as I say, one of the things also we have been doing as part of the increased engagement with both the Scottish and Welsh Government is changing the way that officials engage in order to actually facilitate much more transparency in terms of information.
You see, it seems that the DUP and the ERG have access to the Prime Minister, but you're suggesting that really all you can give me by way of comfort is official-to-official contact. What I'm interested in is whether you or your department have been in contact with the democratically elected governments of Scotland and Wales, minister to minister.
I know we have, within the last week, including, as I say, the Minister of State in the department travelling up to Edinburgh to engage with Scottish ministers. In terms of XO, the Scottish Government regularly attend those Cabinet subcommittee meetings as part of our No Deal preparation. In terms of precisely what conversations in the context of the negotiations, I will ensure we get some clarity to you on that. But of course, the Scottish Government has already preempted those negotiations by saying, as I understand it, that you will vote against any deal that we bring back in any event. So obviously, whilst we're happy to engage, it seems whatever we say as part of that engagement will get the same result in terms of any vote in the House of Commons.
Well, as I say, I'd be grateful if you could write to confirm.
Yeah, we look forward to receiving that letter.
When will the Scottish Government see the detail of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration?
Well, that is still, as I say, under intense negotiation at the moment, and those discussions are ongoing.
Okay. Right, Richard Graham, thank you.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, I'm just looking at the agreement on the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, which is a 565-page document. And of course, in the Queen's speech, it's laid out that our top priority effectively is to implement a withdrawal agreement bill, which is the withdrawal agreement plus a new protocol on Northern Ireland. So the only part of this weighty document that is going to be changed is the protocol on Northern Ireland, as I understand it, and within the roughly 170 pages of the protocol on Northern Ireland, can you confirm to us which articles, like Article 6 on the customs territory, are really the ones that are sort of under negotiation?
I'm afraid, with respect, Mr. Graham, I can't. In that, I don't think it'd be appropriate to do so. But we are obviously having those negotiations, and I think to go through the different sections of the Northern Ireland Protocol and start a discussion now when we're at a very sensitive moment in those discussions would not be the right time. And I am sure that all members of the House want the negotiators to have the space in order to work effectively.
I totally understand that. So, in a sense, the question is, if the negotiations are successfully concluded on Thursday and Friday, what sort of information would be provided to members of the House in order for them to be informed before the vote on Saturday morning? Are you, for example, anticipating that a summary of the main changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol could be published before the House sits?
Well, I think we did touch on this point before, and I'm not going to get drawn on exactly what papers will and will not be shared. Of course, in terms of any sitting, that will be an issue for the Leader of the House in terms of his statement tomorrow.
The other aspect, of course, of these negotiations is the political declaration, which you've touched on. Is there any intention to publish any changes to that before any vote on a withdrawal agreement on Saturday?
Well, again, I think it relates to your previous question. I think what we are very clear is we need to ensure that information is shared with members of the House in order for them to proceed. But the key issue is to reach an agreement, and that is what we're focused on, and that is the key challenge ahead.
Some people, of course, and particularly those who voted for the Benn Act, believe that the Benn Act has been helpful in trying to prevent no deal. Others of us believe that the risk involved in continuing to try and prevent no deal by extending our period of Article 50 and therefore not reaching a conclusion on a deal risks precisely the opposite effect, and that were this country to have to go to a general election in order to resolve the complete failure of this Parliament to determine how we leave the European Union, the next Parliament might take a very different view and might proceed direct to no deal. Do you think that that risk is a real one for those of us who wish to leave the European Union but with the best possible deal?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of the views of colleagues on the legislation in the name of the Chair, I suspect what I say will not change their view on that, in that those who supported it in the first stage will think it will have been helpful, and those who didn't will think it wasn't.
And that,
personally,
way,
as part of the negotiating team, I feel it's been extremely unhelpful in terms of negotiations, but colleagues across the House will have their own view.
Well, that, by the way, Secretary of State, is precisely the reason why some of us wish to make sure that the chairman of this committee provides evidence to the committee, because that is an important issue that needs to be fleshed out. But anyway, please.
Well, that's the matter for the committee, and I'm sure the Chair will appreciate, not for me that's a committee matter to resolve. I think in terms of the wider point you raise, Mr. Graham, I do think that that delay leads to a worse outcome for those of us who want to ensure that the UK leaves in a smooth and orderly way. And that is why I think we're at such a pivotal moment now, because I think the time is right for a deal. I think the time is now for us to come together. I think it is very much in the interests of both sides to do so. I think there's a recognition on both sides that is the best way forward. And in part for reasons we've heard from members of the committee, in order that we can then get on to the future relationship and also the very strong bilateral relationships that we have with member states. But probably above all, and I felt this very strongly when I have been in capitals and spoken to UK citizens there. I think a smooth and orderly deal enables us also to safeguard the citizens' rights part of the withdrawal agreement, which is an issue I know many people feel extremely strongly, both EU citizens in the UK, who we hugely value. We're very grateful they've chosen to make their lives in the UK. And the withdrawal agreement, I think, will, even though we've guaranteed their rights, I think the withdrawal agreement will send a very positive message to them, but also for our UK nationals across Europe.
Yeah, I think there's no question that for many of us, the importance of resolving the issues for citizens is a crucial goal. Can I ask Secretary of State, were you surprised by the European Parliament's President David Sassoli's comments after meeting the Prime Minister on the 8th of October? He said specifically to reporters afterwards that if the UK government's latest proposals are all that is on offer, then the UK Prime Minister doesn't want an agreement. What did you make of that?
Well, I think there is recognition across Europe that the Prime Minister wants a deal. I think that has been reflected in the very constructive tone taken by EU leaders who have themselves said they can see a pathway to a deal. And that they are keen to see the UK leave in a smooth and orderly way. Yeah. And I think there's a very constructive spirit, both on the EU side and on the UK side, and we're very keen to move forward on that basis.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to turn first of all to the political declaration. I was with a number of trade union representatives yesterday from a UK business which accounts for, by some estimates, 2% of the entire GDP of the country. And they clearly were absolutely really concerned about the possibility of no deal. But they were also concerned about what might be in this political declaration as against the former Prime Minister's political declaration, which they had been largely content with, which is one reason why I supported it and you supported it. What, in general terms, could I say to such trade union representatives that might be comforting about the political declaration and the future process of negotiations once, as I very much hope, we achieve a withdrawal agreement?
Yeah, no, I think you reflect a very serious concern. It's one they've raised with me when I met with Francis O'Grady or Len McCluskey in the past. They were very clear on the importance of these issues. We discussed it also as part of the talks between the previous government and the Labour front bench at that time. I think if you look at the Queen's speech, Mr Lefroy, you will see a government committed to very high standards in ways that are previously referenced. The UK has always been a world leader in many of its standards, and if one looks at the post-Brexit economy the UK is seeking to achieve, it is one of high productivity, high skill. The fact that when the UK leaves the EU, the top 10 universities in Europe, none of them will be within the EU. 8 will be in the UK, 2 will be in Switzerland. And the sort of economy that we're seeking to build is one of good regulatory standards. But it comes to the point that Mr McFadden raised, which is what matters is the outcome, rather than saying one has to necessarily be lockstep in approach on regulation. So that's part of a discussion to be had. Clearly, level playing field is shaped by the future relationship, and that is part of that discussion that will be had in due course.
You've frequently referred to best-in-class free trade deal. By my calculation, if we have an agreement and leave with an agreement at the end of this month or shortly thereafter, there will be between 12 and 14 months until the end of 2020, which is the end of the initial transition period, to negotiate such a thing. Do you see the possibility of that happening? I know you're likely to say we are already in conformity in so many areas, but given the complexity and given the need to get something in excess of 30 different parliaments to agree to such a free trade deal. Do you think that that is possible?
I think there's a separate question around ratification, but in terms of the wider points around whether the future agreement can be done within what is now a slightly reduced implementation period, I do. And I think first and foremost because, as you reference, we start from a position of regulatory alignment. And if you look at the traditional trade deals, a huge amount of the front-end time is taken in terms of understanding the respective positions in terms of the different economies. And so we actually start from a very advantageous position. There's also, one can get into, there's much bigger debate around this, but also just to give just one example, just logistically, teams can move much quicker because geographically, the distances, if you're flying from North America and you're bringing teams over, usually you work on 6-week cycles, whereas actually in these trade talks we'll be able to move it much quicker, partly because of geography and partly because of where we start from. So I think there are opportunities there. Another reason why we can move more quickly is because we do have a framework through the political declaration, which is why the political declaration, I think, is important, albeit I respect the fact some colleagues feel otherwise. But I do think the political declaration is important in terms of setting that framework. So I do believe we can do that within the timescale, and that will be absolutely the government's commitment.
And do you think those negotiations could give rise to a number of agreements, and I'm not just talking about a trade agreement, a security agreement, perhaps 3 or 4, but even within trade, a number of agreements whereby perhaps the easier areas are dealt with very quickly, so that the whole package is not complicated by having some rather difficult areas which may apply to perhaps a fairly small part of the economy holding up matters?
Well, I think if I look at the level of debate which is still ongoing around the sequencing of the first phase and whether simply dealing with the winding down arrangements separate from the future trade agreement has contributed to some of the difficulties the previous Prime Minister had in respect of the backstop, then I think you forgive me for not at this point getting into a big debate on how we will structure that. But within your question, inherently, there will be certain things that sit outside, not least on the security side, which doesn't sit within the normal. So there will be some discussions alongside where there is common interests, separate to what is normally within the bounds of a standard free trade agreement.
And do you expect within the withdrawal agreement the condition or the opportunity to have an extension of a withdrawal of an implementation period, if necessary, to conclude the negotiations, will remain?
The Prime Minister's position on this is very clear, which is that we are committed to concluding that by the December 2020 deadline.
So you are, and he is convinced that it can be done by then?
Yes, we are.
And that includes all aspects, including security?
We're committed to that timetable and to moving at pace with colleagues in Europe to deliver on it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sammy Wilson.
Can I take you back to where we were at the very start on the whole issue of the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly? The reason that you gave, though I'm sure it wasn't an extensive, the full range of reasons, but one of the reasons you gave was that if the deal was to get through Parliament, it would require support of the DUP, and we've made it clear that consent is an important issue. But is the real issue here not the Belfast Agreement? This committee has been almost hysterical in its defence of the Belfast Agreement. But given that this is a controversial issue, that it will lead to a change in the powers of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and it therefore falls under the terms of the Belfast Agreement, where there has to be cross-community consent for any change of that nature, especially if there's to be giving over of regulatory powers to the EU on a limited range of issues. So, can we avoid the issue of the consent of the Assembly without tearing up that a very important part of the Belfast Agreement, and that's not just against the spirit of the agreement, but it's explicitly against the terms of the agreement.
Well, Mr Wilson, what I would do is refer back to the letter that the Prime Minister set out on the 19th of August, when, in setting out to President Tusk his reasons for seeking changes to the backstop, central to that was his third point, which said that it was increasingly clear that the backstop risks weakening the delicate balance embodied in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which speaks to the point that you raise. Within that, he then went on to add in his letter of the 2nd of October on his fourth point, which was that the regulatory zone that he was proposing must depend on the consent of those affected. And again, that speaks to the point. Now, as you will, I'm sure, be aware, we are in ongoing negotiations in respect of this agreement, and you wouldn't expect me, I'm sure, to get into the detail of that in a forum such as this. But I think the Prime Minister communicated through his letter on the 19th of August and on the 2nd of October his recognition that safeguarding the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was central to the proposals that the government was putting forward, and that any proposal around a regulatory zone needed to be linked to the principle of consent.
And I wouldn't expect you to get into the details of the negotiations, but what I would like to hear from you is a confirmation that the terms which are set out in the Belfast Agreement for consent for a controversial issue or an issue which requires a change in the powers of the Assembly or requires legislation would be the method by which this consent would be sought, not, as the Irish Government has said, simply by a majority vote, but by a cross-community vote, which is essentially a part of the terms of the Belfast Agreement.
Well, I think the Prime Minister has, at all stages, including in the letter to which I referred, Mr Wilson, underscored that our proposals are centred on our commitment to solutions that are compatible with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and he set that out in his letter. Now, it is then an issue for the negotiating teams in terms of how the proposal put forward by the Prime Minister is then taken forward, but he has at all stages underscored his commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
No, but with respect, Minister, it's not an issue for the negotiating teams to decide how that's taken forward, not if it is explicit in what we are told time and time again in this committee is an internationally binding agreement, which very clearly, in fact, in very, very explicit and detailed terms, sets out how cross-community support has to be measured in the Assembly. All I really want to hear from you today is that the terms of the Belfast Agreement, which everybody seems to be wanting to defend, will be the terms on which consent for opting into arrangements which diminish the powers of the Northern Ireland Assembly, which will treat Northern Ireland differently to a certain extent than the rest of the United Kingdom, that consent will be sought on the basis of the agreement.
Well, as I've underscored, and I think the best reference back is to what the Prime Minister himself wrote, and what the Prime Minister himself wrote was of our commitment to find solutions which are compatible with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and the Prime Minister has been very consistent on that, and I think that is part of what was set out on the 2nd of October, and that very much frames the approach that he takes.
Having served in Northern Ireland Assembly, I know that when it came to decisions of the executive, that there had to be agreement by both the main majority of unionists and nationalists for any legislation to go forward, and then there had to be a vote in the Assembly which included the vote and the support of unionists and nationalists before, even if a majority of people voted in favour of something, if there wasn't a majority of unionists and nationalists, it could go through. And I think it's important that that is understood as the mechanism. Can I take you to the second issue? And I know that you don't want to talk about the details of negotiations, but one thing which is quite apparent, because the Irish government has been looking at very extensively, is that one of the sticking points is whether or not there has to be some customs element to any agreement. Yesterday we had evidence given to us by Dr. Verney, who indicated that the kinds of solutions that were being sought here, for example, goods moving into Northern Ireland until their final destination was known, European duties would be imposed on them. That could lead to additional costs for Northern Ireland businesses of up to £500 million. In the event, plus all the administrative checks that we were required to trace those goods and give assurances that didn't actually go into the European Union or whatever, I hope that, first of all, the government is not contemplating that, but secondly, what assessment has the government made of any such arrangements which would require tariffs, albeit to be paid and then rebated to the businesses in Northern Ireland? What assessment have they made of the impact that would have, first of all, on red tape, and secondly, on costs to Northern Ireland businesses?
Well, I mean, any impact flows from the arrangements that are put in place, and obviously those arrangements are determined and shaped by, firstly, the negotiation that is very much ongoing, and secondly, by whether the House then approves that moving forward. As you say, Mr Wilson, one of the things the Prime Minister is very, very keen to do is to understand the various interests and the concerns that people have. That's why he has been engaging widely as part of that process. And these are issues that obviously are subject to live discussions at the moment, and it wouldn't be appropriate to get into today.
Could you confirm that if Northern Ireland, because one of the suggestions being made is that there are additional costs that Northern Ireland businesses could be compensated for those costs, if we sign up to abiding by some EU regulations, that then state aid rules would apply and that support could not be given to businesses which were caught with those additional costs?
Well, again, we get into sort of areas of quite complexity, but the wider point and part of the package, Mr Wilson, that the Prime Minister has set out in terms of the New Deal for Northern Ireland is a recognition of a wider point, and he spoke specifically on this in his party conference speech, where he talked about his desire to level up the United Kingdom as a whole, and part of the proposal within what he set out to the Commission in terms of a new deal for Northern Ireland was a recognition that as part of that levelling up agenda, there are areas within Northern Ireland, as there are elsewhere in the United Kingdom, where there is a need to level up, and that is also part of the wider package that's under consideration.
But you accept that if additional costs were imposed as a result either of different administrative arrangements or different customs arrangements, that would actually make that levelling up much more difficult than it is at present, especially if EU state aid rules were to apply to Northern Ireland?
These things need to be looked at in the round, and as I say, part of the reason within the package to have the commitment on a new deal is a recognition, as the Prime Minister set out in his party conference speech, of the need to level up those. The wider message that certainly I take from engagement, and also the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland takes from his engagement, is again the desire to ensure we leave in a smooth and orderly way, because that is the way of best addressing the concerns that are being raised.
And the last question then, just in terms of what has been proposed by at least what they have said in public, what the Irish government and the EU have said in public about the different arrangements for Northern Ireland, what assessments has the government made of the kind of checks that we required from GB to Northern Ireland to facilitate, if those demands of the EU and the Irish were to be acceded to facilitate the checks on goods between Northern Ireland, or between GB and Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the absolute priority that we have is to ensure that Northern Ireland will be fully part of the UK customs territory. In terms of the negotiations and how that commitment is then taken forward, obviously one has to have clarity on what those arrangements are before one can start to assess and do any impact assessments or address what mitigations are required. So I think we need to give the negotiators space. I'm sure you would recognise that. These issues will come back to the House for consideration, but we need to ensure that the negotiators are able to proceed.
And by Saturday, will we have clarity on exactly the kind of infrastructure that would have to be put in place if such an agreement were reached, so that people voting in this will be voting on it with total knowledge of the kind of impediments that may be placed on trade between GB and Northern Ireland? Well,
I think the first order of business is to see whether we can secure a deal with the EU. That is what Mr Wilson were absolutely focused on within government on delivering. Once we have that clarity, then clearly there will be an urgent need to bring that matter back to the House and to get into these very important issues that you raise.
Okay. Just to... on that last point that Samuel Wilson's raised, is it the government's policy that it would not accept customs checks in the Irish Sea? The government's policy, I'm not asking what's going on in the negotiations, but is it the government's policy that it is opposed to customs checks in the Irish Sea?
Well, again, what we've said throughout is it is essential that the Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom customs territory. Because that is a sort of fundamental point in terms of UK sovereignty and UK control of its trade policy. Again, once we start to get into the details operationally then as to some of the arrangements, that is an issue that is part of the negotiations. And I think colleagues would understand, given the sensitivity of the point at which we reach, that it is better that we come back to the House and discuss these issues once there is further clarity.
Okay, Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Chair, and many thanks for your patience, Secretary of State. I think we've actually overrun our time now, but if I could just test your patience a little further. Just building on what my colleague, Mr McFadden, was asking about the political declaration on the future relationship, and specifically on this issue of regulatory divergence. You received a letter from 5 key manufacturing industries, alongside Mr Gove, I believe, aerospace, automotive, chemicals, food and drink and pharmaceuticals. All of those industries are responsible for employing thousands and thousands of people in our constituencies, and I have no doubt in yours as well. And they raised very serious concerns about regulatory divergence. They talked about the damage which would be done by the current approach on regulatory divergence. They said pan-European regulatory alignment has been a success in our industry, supporting continued creation and retention of highly skilled manufacturing jobs in the UK. It is important this regulatory alignment should continue after Brexit as a critical element of the UK's future relationship with the EU. Do you intend to respond to that letter? And if so, could you give us a sense of what we'll be saying in the response?
Well, I think that letter, which I very much recall, in part because of the seniority of those that sent it, is part of a very extensive amount of engagement we have been doing with the business community and others throughout this process. And I'm sure we will respond. Partly of it will be shaped by the negotiations that are ongoing in terms of how we move forward. But the wider point is that the best way of addressing the concerns, and I know you've spoken very eloquently about this in the Chamber yourself, is the implementation period gives business confidence through a deal moving forward. Now, in terms of the wider political declaration and the time frame of that is part of the negotiations that we are having. But the key issue from a UK point of view is we have world-leading standards. There is no intention to have some sort of race to the bottom deregulatory approach for reasons that I've already set out. And if one looks at the Queen's speech, you see from the Prime Minister a very strong commitment to having high standards.
But clearly this change in policy from the government, dropping level playing field, is about I think what Mr. McKinley was referring to earlier about being prepared to do deals with other bits of the world, the concern that these absolutely key manufacturing industries is raising is that by engaging in that strategy, you will by definition be opening the risk in the Europeans' eyes of social dumping, environmental dumping, and creating what Angela Merkel said in her speech in Paris, a Singapore-on-Thames, right on the other side of the Channel. And surely you would agree that the EU will then be inevitably bound to raise non-tariff barriers to ensure that it's protecting its market and its standards. But so you've said that the outcome is shaped by the inputs, but if the inputs are bound to lead to a lack of a minimisation of access for these key products and these key industries into that key market on the other side of the Channel, you surely recognise that that could potentially do serious damage to the British manufacturing industry.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Gill, there's probably more common ground in our positions than perhaps the debate might suggest, in that, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're alluding to the fact that there is an interplay between market access and what commitments are made. And I absolutely recognise that. It'd be, when I spoke about legitimate EU equities, obviously one of the issues they will have, which is on the one hand, they want access themselves to the UK market. It is an important market. But in terms of the size of the EU market, there is always, in any trade deal, and I referenced even within the CETA trade deal, there is language on this point around the trade-off in a trade deal between what commitments are given and what market access you undertake. And that's why I reference back to a slide which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the famous staircase escalator slide, where the Commission themselves made a similar point. So I don't think, if I may say, that you and I, if I'm understanding correctly, are disagreeing, that there is this interplay, and part of the negotiation will be to have discussions of this very order.
But if I could just bring it back also to the sort of question of the parliamentary arithmetic to which Mr. Ginogly referred, you must surely see and understand that when Labour members of Parliament see a letter like that from aerospace, automotive, chemicals, food and drink and pharma, major employers in our constituencies, it rings very large alarm bells with us. And I just don't really understand why the government chose to put that line in that Mr. McFadden referred to earlier, explicitly saying there is no need for the extensive level playing field arrangements envisaged in the previous protocol, because that's clearly what triggered this letter and these concerns. So can you, given the parliamentary arithmetic, given the serious concerns raised in this letter, can you please explain what was the thinking that underpinned putting that sentence in?
Well, I think, so the thinking is because the government was able to be more explicit than the previous government in terms of the future relationship. In fact, one of the criticisms I received on behalf of the previous government was that the political declaration was too wide in scope. And you'll be familiar in terms of your own conversations with EU interlocutors that they previously questioned whether the UK had been specific enough in terms of what future relationship it was seeking, and that is a question that the Prime Minister has answered, and therefore the line to which you referred is a reflection of that. But moving forward, I'm very aware of the parliamentary arithmetic. I'm very happy to reach out and to have further conversations away from the committee with colleagues on all sides of the House on these issues. Of course, in terms of the third meaningful vote, which failed to carry the House, that was separate to many of these issues. But at the same time, I do recognise these are important issues for members across the House, and I'm very happy to have further discussions with them as part of that.
One final point. I mean, on the political declaration, I mean, I accept that it's going to be a movable feast to some extent during the transition period, and the government will need to agree a negotiating mandate with the European Union, and you move forward through the various stages. But the reality is, when we go through those division lobbies to vote, we're voting on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. And the political declaration is a vitally important and politically binding statement of intent, because whilst I would love to dream that we will have Labour governments for the next 100 years. The chances of that, I'm sure everyone would agree, are fairly slim. So we're voting in light of the possibility that there may not be a Labour government negotiating the turning the political declaration into an international treaty which will define the future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom for generations to come, potentially. So when we go through those division lobbies, we are doing so on the basis of an understanding that this is a binding political declaration which actually transcends party politics. Would you agree that that's a fair interpretation? Of what
So I would very much
for?
agree, Mr. Kinnett, that the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration are part of a package, where, if I may say, I'd slightly disagree, is that previously a huge amount of work was done to try and address concerns around across the House. And yet even on the third meaningful vote, when it was purely on the withdrawal agreement and not linked to the political declaration, then the arguments to which you've just referred at that time were not persuasive to many colleagues across the House. So I think the key issue is very happy to have further conversations with members on all sides. But clearly it will be shaped by the future negotiation, and in order for us to get into that, we need to be able to pass the withdrawal agreement.
One very final point. I see the point that you're making around having no political declaration whatsoever, which in effect that was the third meaningful vote, was just the withdrawal agreement and no political declaration. But I mean, in a sense, that it makes you even more of a hostage to fortune, because you have no statement of intent whatsoever then, but you do have lines like this in the letter that was sent saying we're going to drop all the level playing field arrangements. So I would gently suggest that it is better, I think, for the government to come forward with a clear statement of what it intends in terms of the future relationship, because then we at least know what we're doing and people know what they're voting for or against in that circumstance.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, Secretary of State, that is it. Can I just say, for the record from the Chair, that no member of this committee is biased. We just happen to have different views and everyone is entitled to hear them, including yourself. We're very grateful to you for coming this morning. Yeah. And if I can end by saying, may there be light at the end of everyone's tunnel. Yes. Order, order.
Thank you, Roger.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.